Hi, this is O'Connor. Welcome back. We're into week 3, and in some ways, this week is special because it's the launching ground for the next 4 or 5 weeks. What we cover in this chapter is a big summary of the next 4 or 5 chapters. Let's get into this, shall we? The learning objectives is to become familiar with the different ways in which organizations fight fraud, to understand the importance of fraud prevention, and which includes developing a culture of honesty, hiring the right kind of employees, assess and being able to mitigate the risk of fraud. And then we're looking at fraud detection. So fraud, the act of some theft or fraud happening, and how do you detect it? And then fraud investigation, gathering the evidence, who's responsible, things like that. And then finally, launching legal action. So there's a lot to take in here, and we're going to take in more detail over the coming weeks. But let's get into some framework, shall we? And this is the best framework that I've put together that encapsulates what's going on in chapter 3. And that is right at the bottom, you have fraud prevention. Then you have fraud detection, then fraud investigation, and then you have legal action right at the top. And consider this. In the short term, fraud prevention is quite expensive because you have to invest capital and you don't see the return because your return should be zero fraud. All right. You understand what I'm talking about. So it's hard to justify to management. We need to spend these millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud prevention. And they say, well, what's our return? No fraud. Okay. It's very hard to get an ROI on that. But fraud detection is something like, well, let's invest into documentation, into auditing, into monitoring, so we catch fraud. And then next is fraud investigation, gathering evidence, and then legal action, as I said. But I want you to think that the cost of fraud being committed actually goes up as you go from detection to investigation to legal action. In other words, once a fraud has been perpetrated, then the cost can balloon ginormously to a greater amount than any dollars that you spent on fraud prevention. So that's why it's really good to invest in fraud prevention and have zero fraud. And that's how you have maximum control over your fraud risk. So in the cloud above, remember this, there is a preventative cost versus a reduced fraud benefit trade-off to be made. And that's what we're going to be considering in these coming chapters. All right. So fraud prevention, I just want to briefly introduce, is about developing a culture of honesty and about assessing the risks of fraud and developing concrete responses to mitigate the risk and eliminate the opportunities for fraud. And as the founder and CEO of Treasury Prime said, by actively preventing fraud rather than merely detecting it after the fact, you can build trust with customers, protect your reputation, and avoid significant financial losses. Wow, is that possible? Well, not if you don't invest right at the get-go. All right. So the first part of fraud prevention is creating a culture of honesty and high ethics. And that starts with tone at the top, senior management setting the right tone through role modeling, through their right leadership and communications to the employees. Next, hiring the right kind of employees, making sure integrity and ethics, getting proper references, making sure there's no criminal record of the employees that is associated negatively with the type of work that they will be doing. Next, communicating expectations of honesty and integrity throughout the organization. Then 4, creating a positive work environment. And that is encouraging feedback, having transparent performance evaluation process and open door policies. Finally, proper handling of fraud and fraud perpetrators. And that is referring a fraud to the police if it is a criminal offence. That is firing the employee and writing them up or taking them to court, civil litigation, if necessary, to make sure that they are unemployable by another organisation and commit a larger fraud then. So we think about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'd think, okay, so where do you begin? What practical or tangible action should organizations do in starting to create a culture of honesty and high ethics? Apart from the tone at the top, which would be a no-brainer, and it would be a non-starter if we didn't have the right tone at the top, the next big thing an organization should do, apart from hiring the right kind of employees, is undertaken fraud awareness training amongst all employees. So you create a greater awareness. If you don't train employees, how can you get them to know, to whistleblow, to monitor, to, if they see something wrong, then they should report it? How do they know if something is wrong if they haven't been trained in terms of what the company requires in terms of the minimum standards of behavior by their employees? All right. Tone at the top, hiring the right employees, and getting that fraud awareness training undertaken. Big things to start with immediately. Wow. What else? Apart from the culture of honesty and high ethics, we've got this assessing and mitigating risks. And there's 4 items here. And with any risk assessment, we need to think of having a torch, and you go into a room and you're shining it somewhere. And that's what we do with the first step. And that is, we are shining the torch around the organization to identify the sources and measuring risks, and then listing, okay, here are the risks. Is it with the vendors? Is it with key positions? Is it with the physical locations? What about transaction touch points with the customers, with the distributors? All right. And so once you have identified the key risk areas, then you can do 2, 3, and 4. And what is that? Number 2, implementing appropriate preventative and detective controls to mitigate those risks. And as I said there, tone at the top, and a whole range of controls that we will go into in the coming weeks. And then there's detection, having a whistleblowing system, having proactive checks of transaction records and documents. Then, related to the fraud awareness training, we're going to create widespread monitoring by employees. So you can't just ask them to go and monitor for fraud if you don't do fraud awareness training. Number 4, having internal and external auditors who provide independent checks on performance. The internal auditors checking on employee fraud risk, employee asset misappropriation fraud. Then you have external auditors, by and large, focusing on management fraud, specifically associated with earnings management and things like that. Of course, they're going to look at other aspects of fraud, but external auditors are more likely to be independent to capture misdoings by the top management compared to internal auditors. Wow. All right. So fraud detection. I've just looked at fraud prevention. Now we want to go to fraud detection. And it's really interesting that we have fraud detection, because by the time you have trying to detect fraud, it's kind of too late. You want to prevent fraud and not see it at all. But let's look at what Christopher Danvers, the Senior Management of Card and Payment Strategy at Helix by Q2, he said, fraud detection without prevention is just creating a data function designed to report bad news. Impressive decks, petty graphs can help take the sting out of the message. But at the end of the day, you're just reporting that fraud has occurred, and it was at this cost to your organization. Okay, so it's kind of like I said, oh, you must think about fraud detection, but then you read this quote here and it really says, well, what is the value of fraud detection? Well, you still need to know if fraud is occurring. The whole idea to control fraud is really at the prevention level, but you still need to think about what mechanisms are going to enable you to detect fraud. And they are the following. They are by chance, by providing ways for people to report suspicions of fraud, like a whistleblowing system, tips and complaint system, or by proactively examining transaction records and documents to determine if there are anomalies that could represent fraud. Okay, so we've talked about fraud prevention, then we've moved to fraud detection. Now we want to go to fraud investigation. But wait a minute. Before we can go to fraud investigation, we need to be sure. And that's why the next slide is really, really critical. And that is, there is a very important step between fraud detection and fraud investigation. Fraud detection, where someone has given a complaint or a tip, you have found some documentary evidence. So you need to think about, is what you have detected enough for a predication? A predication means the following. It refers to the circumstances taken as a whole that could lead to a reasonable, prudent professional to believe a fraud has occurred, is occurring, or will occur. So fraud investigations should not be conducted without a predication. Okay, so what is the nature of the fraud that you think has occurred or is occurring? And who are the likely culprits that you think are suspect? So this is all in the predication, all right? A specific allegation of fraud against another party is not necessary, but there must be some reasonable basis for concern that fraud may be occurring. Okay. So it's kind of like the gel that goes between detection and fraud investigation, because once you move to fraud investigation, things get more expensive and things get more costly if it turns out to be incorrect, especially with reputation concerns and so forth. So an investigation is usually undertaken to determine whether or not fraud is actually occurring. The focus of the investigation is to uncover the facts, to uncover the truth. The purpose to find the truth: do the symptoms observed represent fraud, or do they represent unintentional errors or other factors? Wow. Okay. So we can approach fraud investigation in the following ways. We can undertake interviews, computer searches of emails, records, and examination of accounting records and internal controls. And as is said later in the chapters, you don't go and interview your number one suspect at the get-go. You wait for them at the end. You want to gather your evidence first. So fraud investigation methods can be classified according to the types of evidence produced and the elements of fraud, which are documented on the next slide. But you note this is probably the most important takeaway before you get on your high horse and go and investigating and try to find out the suspects and to be the Columbo or be the detective. Before you put your detective hat on, think of the risk of a poor investigation. If investigations are not poorly conducted, any or all of the following might occur. Number one, reputations of innocent individuals can be irreparably injured. Guilty parties can go undetected and be free to repeat the act. And the offended entity may not have information to use in preventing and detecting similar incidents or recovering damages. And not to mention the damage to the reputation of the organization if any of this suspect investigation gets out that turns out to be false. So you need to keep these investigations under wraps. Yes. All right. Now, I know there's two figures that are mentioned in the textbook. One is to do with the evidence, and we're spending more time on what is the nature of evidence later in the semester. We're talking about testimonial evidence, documentary evidence, physical evidence, and personal observations. And of these, documentary evidence and probably physical evidence is probably the most important and the most resilient types of evidence out of these four areas of evidence, because they stay the same day in, day out. And so it's easy for you to collect that evidence, put it away somewhere, and take it out on the day of the court proceeding, on the day of the investigation. All right. Let's have a look at one more diagram, and that is the elements of fraud. Last week, we looked at the fraud triangle. That is the pressure to undertake fraud, the opportunity for fraud, and the rationalization, the psychology, the mental gymnastics you go through to convince yourself that you did the right thing by undertaking the fraud. Now this week we're looking at the elements of the fraud. So don't get that mixed up with the first part. The elements of the fraud are associated with the actual theft act. All right. So we've got the theft act, that is the process of stealing, the process of taking the tip, the process of skimming, the process of asset misappropriation, the process of doing the fraud. Okay. Then we've got the conversion. After you have done the fraud, then you need to convert it into money that you can spend. And then finally, you need to want to be able to conceal that fraud, that is, hide it. Remember what I said in week 1, the difference between fraud and a bank robbery. Okay, bank robberies are not fraud. Why? Because bank robberies are rarely concealed. Frauds, the best frauds are concealed. All right, they're hidden. They're done in a way that people don't notice them unless there's some detection measures in place, unless there's some fraud investigation being undertaken. So there's the fraud element triangle, the theft act, the conversion, and the concealment. Wow. So we want to finish up on fraud investigation approaches, and that is they must be undertaken to establish the truth. And investigators must be experienced and objective. Part of the outcome of this course is that you have the basic knowledge to begin an investigation. And of course, it takes years of experience before you can become a fully competent fraud investigator. So don't put pressure on yourself. You must start somewhere. And so investigators must ensure that only those who have a need to know are keep apprised of the investigation activities. And they must ensure that all information collected is independently corroborated. And they must exercise care to avoid questionable investigative techniques. And finally, they must report all facts fairly and objectively. And so these are really hard skills to just learn from a textbook. And so that's what I mean. You become aware by reading the textbook, undertaking this unit, but then you hone these skills through years of experience of investigating, practicing, in other words. So let's go on to follow up legal action. And that is the last part. And you don't even want to get to this stage. Number one, because it's expensive. And number two, by the time you are pursuing legal action, now it's likely your company's brand reputation is out in the public, and it's less likely to be positive. It's likely to be negative. It's likely to be damaging. And you may lose sales. You may lose future growth opportunities because of the reputation caused by undertaking criminal action and civil action. But just note this, and we go into more detail in weeks to come later in the semester, and that is you can choose to undertake civil action. But if you want to undertake criminal action, you need to refer it to the police, to a district prosecutor, because it's the government that undertakes civil action. And you would refer it when the fraudster has committed a criminal act outlined by the statutes of the state that you live in or the country that you live in. Okay, you cannot take criminal action on bylaws or your own laws that you set up in your own organization. Now, civil action is another thing. You can bring a civil action where you bring a fraud investigator in to say how much damages were caused by this fraud, and then you undertake civil action to get recompense, to get the fraudster to pay back those damages, even in addition to firing them and outing them for their reputation for future employment. All right. So you don't even want to get to this stage. So that's why the big message of this chapter is the best approach to dealing with fraud is to not have it happen to begin with. And that is to invest in fraud prevention activities. And that's why I show you this pyramid for you to take away. If you invest in fraud prevention activities, tone at the top, proper hiring of employees, fraud awareness training, proper communication, proper steps and procedures for dealing with fraudsters that everyone knows about, that they will be fired, that they will be asked to pay back, that they will be taken to court under civil penalties, etc. If everyone knows these things, then this all contributes to a stronger fraud preventative culture and climate in the organization. But get this, fraud awareness training is a big thing, and it is lost by a lot of organizations. They fail to recognize the value of doing that. When you have fraud prevention, you have greater control over fraud risk. Welcome to week 3. This is a great introduction for the coming weeks, where we look at fraud prevention, fraud detection, fraud investigation, and legal action in greater detail. This is O'Connor, and see you in the class. Bye for now.